and we outlined the 3 priorities going forward. And it will sound fairly familiar, but first and foremost that we want to create business-friendly climate and stimulate private sector jobs in the state of Minnesota. Secondly, government needs to live within its means. And thirdly, government needs to be effective, efficient, and cost-effective and smarter.
Does the governor-elect's position on taxes create an inevitable clash coming soon?
Well, I think when both Amy and I and Geoff and Matt, we all met individually with House and Senate and with the governor, and we actually started off on the things that we agreed on, which was regulatory reform, which was permitting, which was how do we make our business climate better. I think if you start with that, maybe we don't get to that. Maybe then again we do, but I think our first and foremost, what we've set out as our goal is to work on the things we agree on, to maybe some policy changes early on in session that we can get to his desk and pass. And then, if we get to that point, it may happen, but we're going to start with the things we agree on.
Yes, the state is making promises with its budget and its projected budget deficit that we can't keep. We get that. We get that. I wouldn't describe it as a $6 billion hole. I would totally agree that we have a lot of budget work to do, and that's job 1. And it's probably jobs 2, 3, and 4 for this legislative session.
Michelle, if there's not a $6 billion budget shortfall, is there a different number that the legislature is going to work off of in creating budget bills?
Well, I think we've consistently kind of talked about we have roughly 5% new growth coming in revenue to the state. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're going to live. That when we talk about living within our means, that's the number we're going to hit. And if great things happen and the economy starts to move even quicker than that, well then the state may be blessed with a little more in taxpayer money, but we're not going to raise taxes to fill that.
But if the executive branch is working off one number and the legislative branch works off a different number, isn't that a potential collision?
Well, the number is what the number is. We'll have an additional $1.5 billion projected growth in the next biennium. So we'll be working off the same numbers, I think, Mary. It's a little bit of a different perspective, but the number is the number. We'll have $1.5 billion additional revenue.
Would you look for any new revenue possibly through gambling?
We're really focused right now on the spending side of the equation, and so from our perspective, that's what we need to get under control. We're making promises we can't keep. We're spending beyond our existing budget, and so that's going to be our focus.
So it's not going to be simply a question of whether or not we need new revenue. And this talk about an all-cuts budget is merely a fiction. We know even under Tim Pawlenty over the last 8 years, millions and millions and millions of dollars in new revenue was generated. But it was generated on the backs of working people, and it was generated in the form of property taxes and increased tuition and increased fees of all sorts. But we need to make sure that we are raising and spending money that's responsible, that drives innovation, that represents investment, and that is fair, so that Minnesotans are fairly paying for those things that really make a great Minnesota. In fact, Tim Pawlenty's budget increased burdens on 95% of Minnesotans. And who benefited? Who has less of a burden today? The top 5%. So we're going to be really examining these budgets, so we're not simply perpetuating a Pawlenty legacy. We're going to be working closely with the governor on his priorities and his proposals, try to solve this budget deficit responsibly and position Minnesota for the future.
Do you look for any new revenue anywhere as Democrats?
Well, I think that's clearly going to be a part of what we do. What form that takes, again, I can't be specific, and I can't speak for what will Senate File 5 be. I don't know what Senate file we get to number, but that'll be a simple fact of matter, and we're going to be working closely with the governor on that.
Yeah, we are going to be working with the governor on that. I mean, I think what our position now in the legislature is, though, is to kind of put the Republicans to the test and see if they can put a budget together that does it without any revenues. That's an all-cuts budget, but does protect their priorities that they've stated about school kids and about older Minnesotans and about people with disabilities, and that also creates the climate where we actually can grow as an economy, investments in roads and all those things that add up to that. And, if they can do that, well, then that's then that changes the discussion. I don't think they can.
How do you communicate the budget situation to the public? We have state agencies, officials saying there's a $6.2 billion budget shortfall, but we have the current governor saying that doesn't exist. We had Senate leadership saying there's not really a $6 billion shortfall. It's really a 5% increase. What's the public to believe or understand here?
The Republican leadership that was up here didn't say there's not a $6.2 billion deficit. And if you go back and watch, they never said that. They, in fact,
Geoff Michel said it's not a $6 billion.
Well, he's wrong then. And they acknowledged what they're doing is saying, and the number, Amy Koch said the number's the number. 6.2 billion is the number, and that 5% they talk about is built into that number. So the that 5% growth is taken into account when they get to the $6.2 billion deficit. The reality is there is a $6.2 billion deficit, a hole that we have to fill. And the other thing that's really important, I think, for the public to understand is that the growth in spending that's built into this budget above and beyond what we spent in the last biennium is about 6% over the biennium. So just over 3% spending growth a year. If you're talking about 14,000 more kids coming into our schools, if you're talking about, the increasing cost of healthcare that we just talked about, if you're talking about the kind of investments that we need to make in our roads and our transportation infrastructure, I think Minnesotans can understand that things are going to grow 3%. We're a bigger population, all those things are built into that. So I don't think we're actually in an unreasonable place with regard to our spending growth. Do we need to do what we can to make sure that we continue to innovate and make government work as effective as possible? Absolutely, and we've been working on that for the last 4 years, and we'll continue to work with the Republicans on that. But the myth out there is that we're going to be able to reform or streamline our way out of a $6.2 billion deficit. That's not the reality. And, there was a lot of talk about mandates when the four leaders were up here. For 8 years that I've been here, people have been talking about mandate relief, whether it's the Republican legislature or the Democratic legislature, all kinds of big plans. But when the bills come to the floor, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, they're pretty thin mandate relief bills. And the mandates are there for a reason, in some sense. So we are joining them in relieving as many as possible, but that's not going to get us out of the $6.2 billion deficit.
And I think that goes back to my earlier point about truth-telling, and we presume a certain level of sophistication and intelligence among Minnesotans, and we simply tell the truth. We have a $6.2 billion deficit, and the reasons for that number are fairly simple. We've got a bunch of kids, new kids. People understand, we're not going to simply abandon 14,000 new kids, and the Republicans are talking about keeping the classroom harmless. We took a couple of big chunks of one-time dollars. We delayed payment to the schools. That's a lot of money, and we have to pay that money back to the schools at some point. Either that or we have to deal with that in the context of our deficit. And we took some one-time dollars from the federal government and used that for ongoing needs. So there's no myth about a $6.2 billion deficit. It's real, and we can add it up very quickly and talk about making key investments that Minnesotans support. Minnesotans support investments in our roads, in our higher ed, in our health care, making sure that elderly people, the poor and disabled, are taken care of, in K-12 education. These are simple things that we do together to make sure that Minnesota is successful.
Is there any place to compromise? Or the Republicans, as I said, refuse to go with any tax increases, and then if Dayton insists on a tax increase? Is there any opportunity for compromise, or do we go to special session and government shutdown?
I hope we don't go to a special session. I think that the opportunity to compromise is going to come from the people of Minnesota, and they're going to have before them a Republican budget that's going to inflict a lot of pain. If they, in fact, can pass an all-cuts budget, it's going to inflict a lot of pain on middle-class families. And all the specifics we talked about cuts to schools and cuts to nursing homes and hospitals and all those things. When the people of Minnesota see that, they're going to either say that's consistent with our values or that's not protecting our priorities, and legislators are going to hear that. And so the ultimate budget solution, because we are facing a budget crisis and an economic crisis, is going to come from the people of Minnesota, and we'll be listening very carefully to them.